The fourth season of The Crown is up, and it has caused a lot of sensation. It covers Great Britain from the late 70s until 1990, and in this new season, apart from protagonist Queen Elizabeth II, two more prominent women enter the stage: Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Lady Diana. Together, they built some kind of female triumvirate, very much shaping British society at that time. Today, we're going to talk about this female triumvirate, its relation to the myth of the British monarchy, and of course, its depiction in the series The Crown. To discuss all this, I invited an expert on cultural history with special focus on gender, sexuality and religion, who published about the public image of both Margaret Thatcher and Princess Diana. Dominic Janes, who is currently professor at Keele University. Dominic, thank you for coming to my channel.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, well, let's start with Diana. Even 20 years after her tragic death, Diana is still causing emotional reactions. The Sunday Mail writes that the royal family is not happy with the new Crown season, seeing itself ill-depicted or even slandered. And right in time with the start of the new season, there has been a new Diana scandal. There are claims that the famous interview Diana gave to the BBC in 1995, in which she talked about her marriage with Prince Charles, was given only because the interviewer had forged documents that seemed to prove a conspiracy against Diana from within the royal court. Dominic, can you tell us why Diana continues to fascinate people so much, in Britain and all over the world?
Well, I guess, a background issue is the continued popular fascination with the British royal family, which is kind of an intriguing issue in itself, because even in Britain, the royal family, well, the phrase is they reign, but they don't rule. So in other words, they preside over the government. They don't actually run the government or shape public policy. And then, of course, even though politically speaking, there are many ways of an irrelevance within their own country, globally speaking, they're even more marginal. So why are people so fascinated? They're particularly fascinated where there's a member of the royal family who has a really charismatic personality, because many of them don't. Diana definitely did. So she had a charismatic personality, and she also looked good on camera. So I think there are a combination of different things there which drew people in to her. And then the other point about Diana is that she had a very dramatic life, a dramatic and ultimately tragic life, and a marital breakdown, which, okay, lots of marriages break down, but hers did it in the full glare of international publicity. So you have a whole series of reasons there why Diana fascinated in the past. Why she continues to fascinate today is something that I think is also very interesting. And one thing that occurs to me is that in Britain, at least, there's a bit of a 1980s revival going on. There's a lot of 1980s music being played on the radio and TV, and a lot of discussion about comparisons between the right-wing politicians of our current age and those of 35 years ago. So for all of those reasons, Diana seems to be back in vogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you write a lot about public images, and I think that bears quite a similarity to what I'm interested in which is historical and political myths. And so I think that there is a crucial element of the Diana myth, if you want to call it that way, and that seems to be her status as a double victim. A victim of the royal family, especially of her husband who caged and betrayed her, and a victim of the media, who hunted her up to an unprecedented extent, an extent that as some argue played even a role in her tragic accidental death. But at the same time, Diana seemed to be quite a master using the mass media for her own purposes, thereby maybe not quite controlling her own narrative, her myth, but at least actively playing a part in shaping that public image, that public myth. So, what would you say? How much truth is there in this myth of victim Diana?
Well, I think one of the things, Benjamin, that you're touching on there is something in society that's been developing over several decades, which is a kind of moralistic narrative. And it's about a binary, and it's about dividing up people and countries and institutions between basically good and bad. And the two categories that are often used are abusers and victims. So, for example, this is, Western imperial nations as abusers, colonized territories as victims. Now, when I'm saying that, I'm not criticizing that. I'm just simply describing it as a narrative that has been quite strongly established. And the same thing has been used by a wide range of different pressure groups to advocate for their position, but also to understand the position of, for example, people who are black as opposed to white in majority white countries, or in relation to the position of women in societies that have been traditionally highly patriarchal. So one of the effects of this in relation to a figure like Diana is that in order for Diana to be seen as a sympathetic character, it's very important that she be understood as the victim of something else, rather than someone who is the inheritor of immense privilege, who then abuses that privilege. So it's an important core element of the Diana myth that she is actually seen as a victim. And the other point, I suppose, in connection with this is that it's a plausible viewpoint from certain angles, because after all, she is, compared with the rest of the royal family that she marries into, disempowered, because historically speaking, women in society, in British society, have been relatively disempowered. And because also in relation to the mass media, people are in fact relatively disempowered in terms of the image that they can determine. So there is a lot of plausible basis for thinking about Diana as a victim. The problem is that that leads to a very kind of one-dimensional appreciation of her as a figure. So seen in its most extreme, there was a sort of popular cult of what was referred to as Saint Diana. And people built, kind of ad hoc shrines to her after she died. Whereas actually really understanding her as a person means getting to grips with the fact that, well, she was a victim, but there are other ways in which she had privilege, and arguably sometimes she abused that privilege in order to get her own ends. Stepping away from all of that, we might say, well, actually, the whole idea of abusers and victims isn't always the best way of trying to understand the important figures in public life.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit about the role Diana plays within this mythical drama, which the British monarchy seems to me. Because the series The Crown is all about the British monarchy during the second half of the 20th century, in modern times. And now in the series The Crown, we've reached the 80s, and Diana comes into play as a new factor for the monarchy. And at the beginning, Diana seems to strengthen the acceptance of the monarchy. But later, her and Charles's scandals seem to undermine it. Today, we have a distance of more than 20 years to that period, And we might try to answer that question. Did Diana ultimately strengthen this myth of the British monarchy, or did she undermine it?
Yes. Well, I'd like to answer that on a couple of different levels.
Mhm.
The first thing is that in a monarchy that reigns but doesn't rule, one of the biggest challenges is, how do you keep public attention? How do you kind of keep people thinking that A, there is a monarchy, and B, that there ought to be a monarchy? So you could argue at a very basic level that Diana did a really, really important service to the monarchy. She raised its profile massively. And people, not just in Britain, but around the world, were involved and debating and thinking about the monarchy and what it was for. So that, I think, certainly helped basically strengthen it. On the other hand, the second thing I'd like to bring up is the issue of scandal. Now, traditionally speaking, scandal has been seen as something that, quote, undermines the monarchy. Now, when I say traditionally, this ancient tradition, in fact, originates in the 19th century. And what we mean by celebrity scandal, in fact, probably originates in the 18th century in kind of gossip culture of the metropolitan elite. So the notion that scandal is important to the operation of the monarchy dates in the 18th century. The notion that scandal is somehow dangerous to the monarchy because a monarchy is meant to be a moral figurehead, that dates from the 19th century. And those ideas were very heavily tested in the early 20th century in connection with the abdication crisis. And at that point, I think because there was a strong belief in the moral leadership of the royal family, the abdication crisis was in fact a kind of scandal which potentially did threaten the institution as it had traditionally been set up. Now, if you leap forward another 40, 45 years, and you land in the 1980s, the 1990s, you have, in many ways, a less monolithically moralistic society. And so therefore, the notion that something that is conventionally scandalous is inherently a problem is not accepted by everyone. So there are large parts of the population, for example, who don't think it's scandalous if a marriage breaks down. Or they don't necessarily think that it's scandalous for a woman or a man to have sex with someone else other than their husband or wife. Okay. So what's happened is that the cultural conditions have changed so that scandal has nudged, if anything, strangely slightly back into the 18th century as more a sense of entertainment as opposed to moralistic judgment. But in fact, it has all of those elements swirling in together, which makes for compelling drama.
Yeah. So if I get you right, you not only say that time has changed and that's why the scandal isn't so scandalous anymore, but also Diana seems to bring a new dimension into it, something like a breath of fresh air into this dusty old world of the monarchy. Because my question would be, why does Diana seem to embody this modernization and Elizabeth, the Queen, doesn't? Because she, why can't you say the same thing about her? Because she is she starts her career as a monarch as a young woman when she becomes queen, and I think you can say in the series The Crown, the first 2 seasons are very empathetic to her struggle with all those restrictive old rules and traditions, and her wish to act out her own personality, and at the same time you don't think of Queen Elizabeth II as a modern woman, as a modern monarch. Why is it that Diana seems to represent modernization and Queen Elizabeth doesn't?
Okay, so there's a couple of different layers here. One of them is how did Queen Elizabeth appear in the 1980s? The other question is, how did Queen Elizabeth appear in the 1950s? So in the 50s, when she first came to the throne, there was a huge push in Britain to project her as modern. And this was very much about projecting the British Empire as something that was part of the modern world, and therefore not some kind of political dinosaur that's just about to go extinct. So that connected also with the fact that she was young then, and it also connected with a, to be frank, relatively more deferential society than existed in the 1980s. So the magic was there for the young Elizabeth in the way that the magic was also there for the young Diana in the 1980s. So the issue really is we're not comparing like with like. Mm-hmm. We're comparing two women of different ages in different decades. Now, I guess the other thing with Diana is that we need to think that by the 1980s, we'd had 3 or 4 decades of youth culture. And what I mean by that is that in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, there was a less established sense in which teenagers and young people and youth should have a separate culture that was distinctive from older people. However, this changes in post-war society. There's a strong expectation that teenagers will develop their own culture, they'll behave in distinct ways, that they will in fact rebel. And that's actually part of what they're supposed to do. So one of the things about Diana is that she needs to be seen in relation to the youth cultures of this, of the later 20th century. And in fact, she often gets a lot of her intense cultural purchase where she crosses between traditional high society and pop culture, dancing around listening to Queen. And we may know that she was friends with Freddie Mercury, for example.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the third woman in this triumvirate, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, yes.
There is this scene in The Crown where she is talking to the Queen, and she tells the Queen that she, Margaret Thatcher, in general, is against women in politics. Because, as she says, women are too emotional to deal with the world of politics. So just like the Queen herself, Thatcher doesn't really seem to use her femininity for the purpose of a modernization of politics and society. On the contrary, Thatcher's politics are widely seen as conservative or even reactionary. But then, Dominic, I read your article arguing that in some ways Margaret Thatcher has become even a gay icon. How does these things fit together?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say about Margaret Thatcher is that she was a radical at the time. So now in Britain, we talk about the difference between conservatives with a capital C and conservatives with a small c. So a capital C conservative is someone who belongs to the Conservative Party. A small c conservative is someone who doesn't want things to change. You want to conserve things. So now one of the things about Margaret Thatcher is she was absolutely not a small c conservative. She went into the Conservative Party, which she thought had become complicit with decline, with declinism, with a fatalistic approach which would assume that Britain was a fading world power and that all you can simply do is to hang on to the resources that you've got for as long as you can. This is not her position at all. And of course, one of the other things to think about Margaret Thatcher is that she was from, in British class terms, a kind of lower middle class provincial background. So she was very unusual in leading the Conservative Party, not just because she was a woman, but also because of where she came from and her social position. And one of the things that's really interesting in The Crown is that she uses those elements as weapons to attack the Queen at various points when she's talking about her self-belief and her reasons for doing what she's doing. Now, that's separate from the way in which Thatcher was subsequently understood or interpreted. And so with the passage of time, what people increasingly saw was the older Thatcher, the Thatcher of her final years, who was seen as herself a figure of decadence, of decline, as an alcoholic, actually, and living in the Ritz, one of the top London hotels, at the expense of media moguls. This is not a radical figure. This is someone who's been bought out, sold out, and collapsing. But I think one of the problems with the depiction of Margaret Thatcher in The Crown is that it panders slightly too much to the memories of the older Thatcher and doesn't quite really engage with her extraordinary energy and also sexiness. So there was a famous comment that Francois Mitterrand made about Margaret Thatcher, that she had the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe. Now, I don't want to step into anyone's Freudian nightmare, but Thatcher in her early years was very strongly associated with sex appeal. And if you like, a kind of kinky sex appeal, where the woman is on top. So where we come to the issue of her, how can I put this, gay following? Well, this is interesting because Diana also had a gay following, but of a slightly different complexion, largely because of her work with HIV and AIDS victims, for example. But the way in which Thatcher was reimagined for certain conservative, and I mean this in both the large C and the large C sense, right? Conservative gay men particularly, was as a figure who was, in gender terms, transgressive. That she was basically a man in a woman's body. And this is the point about the deep voice and all this kind of stuff. So in other words, Thatcher was a queer figure. And the other point about her was that she stood for individualism. So her line on women, well, we have this assertion about her making a point about emotionalism and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I mean, what she stood for is someone who could actually go in there and do the job. Whether she thought other women could do the job is another matter. Now, the point here is that if you follow that logic, whether someone is heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual shouldn't have any reference whatsoever to whether they're able to do a good job in business or politics. So therefore, there is some powerful radical potential behind Thatcher, which led her to be seen as a kind of gay icon by certain kinds of conservative men. Now, I don't agree with this, largely because of the role she played in basically anti-homosexual legislation, and the fact that there was no great evidence at all that she was enthusiastic about sexual diversity. So I think Thatcher as a gay icon has more than a touch of wishful thinking about it, whereas Diana as a gay icon has a lot more purchase.
Okay. Yeah, so you already expressed a slight disappointment on some depictions of the series The Crown. Let's talk about that, because there is an ongoing debate on how close The Crown is to the actual historical facts. On the one side, there are those who say that it's profoundly researched and basically true, maybe apart from some minor artistical liberties. And on the other side, there are those who criticize the series for making up its own mythified version of the past, somehow trivializing and at the same time denigrating the royal family. What do you think? Who is right in this debate? And
Right.
are you satisfied by the depiction of our female triumvirate?
Right. Okay. So the first thing to say is that there are multiple ways of getting at what historical truth might be. One of them is about an obsession with details of, quotes, accuracy. You know, are the cars the right sort of cars that they would have driven in 1985 or whatever else it might be? The other thing is to do with something that actually makes sense as a drama. So it's actually true because it actually gets the core message across, which is actually rooted in what happened in the period. So I think basically what they've done is they only have a limited number of hours in which to try and tell us some really very complicated stories. Because it's not just about what's going on in this family, it's also about what's going on in Britain over a long span of years, which were highly eventful. So that, for example, in the episode on the Falklands, we only get to see effectively a little bit of what happens in relation to the Falklands War. And that's it. They've taken that decision that that's what they need to show you, and we don't need to see anymore. So my kind of feeling is that, no, it's probably not accurate in terms of every small detail. It is a creative interpretation of what these people's characters are. But does it actually give us, I think, an interesting insight into the realities of the 1980s? Well, yes, I think it does. And that is exactly what it's doing. People are actually looking at this and saying, hang on, if you were, you know, old enough to be around at the time, it matches or it doesn't match what I remember. And much of the concern in Britain has actually been, and I think this is quite funny actually, kind of patronizing approach to, quote, young people who don't remember it first time around, who might actually get confused about the difference between drama and reality. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just to kind of sum all of that up in relation to the three characters here, for me personally, I thought the depiction of Diana was very good. I spoke to a friend of mine, his psychotherapist, and he said that in relation to considering someone who probably been in an abusive family, who then moves into a marriage into another abusive family and develops a major eating disorder, it actually rang very true indeed. Mm-hmm. And I thought that the way that her vacillation, her sliding between timidity and huge self-confidence was also highly compelling. In relation to the other characters, what's been said earlier on and commented earlier on about Thatcher was that she's actually played a little bit too old in this. That actually Gillian Anderson kind of creeps around the set in the way that the original version would have swaggered around the set until perhaps the very end of the story that we get. And that actually she uses her sex appeal to flirt with her ministers in ways which are not covered in this, largely because the ministers are reduced to these grey men. It's part of the narrative of the story. And that actually one of the results of that is that you actually play down the sexiness of what's actually going on. A lot of people find power sexy, and these are women who know how to play on that. Diana's not the only one who's playing that game. Now, the third person here, saving the best till last, is the Queen. And she's the one I find most difficult to answer about. How do I feel about her depiction? I think I was startled by how unsympathetic in general her depiction was in this. But I really don't know how to answer. because one of the things about the Queen is that she is supposed to be the figurehead. And this particular Queen has been incredibly good at being a figurehead. So therefore, there's a very strong feeling of someone who is playing a role. And what I don't know, and that may be one of the questions for the creator of the series, is the degree to which she has lost her humanity because she's so used to playing a role every day of her life.
Yeah, that's a tough question because I think the creator of the series, Peter Morgan, said that he wanted to depict the person Queen Elizabeth, the person Elizabeth II. But give me my final question about, and let me make it about Diana again. Do you think that Diana has some kind of special legacy with regards to the royal family? So will she be an example for future queens to come? Will we maybe one day see Kate walking in Diana's footsteps?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I would imagine that most women in the royal family would not want to walk in Diana's footsteps because, of course, she crashed, literally, tragically. Yeah. And the second thing I'd say is that I'm not sure she's exactly going to be a model for future behavior. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't really believe in the sort of the universal side of the royal myth. There's a universal fairy tale that will keep playing itself over and over and over. No, I don't think of that. I think of Diana as absolutely a creature of the 70s, 80s, 90s, that period. And what happened to her is absolutely rooted in the attitudes of that time. So depending on how long the British monarchy carries on, I think we will have scandals. What will be counted as scandal will change. The way that the media works will change. And so there may well be behavior that sort of looks a bit like Diana, but, and this is a really overused term in relation to her, but I'm going to use it, in many ways she was unique.
Well, yes, Dominic, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting interview.